today is the 24th of October. We're meeting in the Angel Pub in St Giles High Street to have a teach-in from Max Klein on capital and history. We've just had the reading group week, which I think quite a few of us attended, and now Max is going to share his reflections on the topic.
Can I have some context? Oh, yeah.
No, I mean, what were you going to say?
Can we have context? So capital and history is regularly redone, right?
Yeah, this is one of the regular teach-ins that Platypus gives, along with like what is a platypus and surviving extinction on the left. But this is the first one I think we've had in quite a while. I think perhaps Rory gave the last one in Starbucks on Kingsdown Road or Kingsway. Yeah, I think when you're ready, Max.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. So I haven't timed myself on this. It'll probably be around 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how fast I talk. So here we go. The purpose of this teach-in, as with Platypus's other activities, such as reading groups and public fora, is to give a clarification about the way Marxism traditionally has seen itself, contrast this with the various current self-understandings of the left in general, and to attempt to interrogate the place of the left today and in modern society more broadly. A core component of this approach is to take nothing for granted. This means to investigate and bring to the forefront some of the most fundamental assumptions that undergird the analyses of Marx and Engels, as well as revolutionaries such as Vladimir Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. Given that Marxism is principally known in the general public as being an anti-capitalist ideology, with its core analytical method of society being historical materialism, history and capital could seem to be natural starting points for an explanation for what Marxism is and historically has been. Yet there are various approaches that one could take towards this question. For example, I could take a very analytic approach and give a sort of sociological definition of capitalism that Marx himself would have used it to analyze modern society. Capitalism, therefore, would be seen as a system based on private ownership of the means of production, whereby the owners, the capitalist class, employ laborers working for a wage in order to sell the products on a market and reinvest portions of the profit back into production with the aim of producing higher returns. While seemingly giving a thorough overview of the core economic features of capitalism, it would be difficult to draw any sort of politics out of this seemingly neutral appraisal, unless one were to simply abstractly moralize the various aforementioned categories of class, wage labor, and profit, which, in my opinion, was manifestly neither the intention of Marx nor of Marxist revolutionaries. Furthermore, one could take the formula above and put it under a mathematical microscope to reveal how any mode of production based on the exploitation of wage labor for the accumulation of surplus value is bound to be full of crises, as Marx himself or economists such as Henrik Grossman did. This would not quite get to the bottom of the specific ways in which Marxism seeks to radicalize capitalist society and push it beyond itself, rather than simply criticize it as being irrational. Many would by contrast state that Marxism is a radicalized form of liberalism, taking its core values and simply sweeping aside its connections to capitalism so that it not be impeded by the capitalist state or the tyranny of the working class. While coming closer to emphasizing the fact that Marx's critique of capitalism is imminent to the categories of prevailing hegemonic ideologies of his and our time, and is not made from an abstract standpoint, but rather from within capitalist modernity's own terms. Like the other definitions I've given, this conception of Marxism's analytic and political purpose would be fundamentally ahistorical, neither accounting for the historical mechanisms that brought liberal ideology about, nor accounting for those that sustain it. Therefore, if one is to give an account of Marxism's claims about the social and economic constitution of modern capitalist society and how Marxists should relate to it politically, one can only view the aforementioned concepts such as liberalism, capitalism, or the economy in the context of the history that produced them, and more fundamentally, as the product of the very understanding of the world through the notion of history. However, unlike with capitalism, history does not lend itself so easily to a simple definition. This is not in the least because our understanding of the past, present, and future, whether or not one is a Marxist or of any other political leaning, is so deeply imbued with the assumption that humans engage with each other and reproduce society on historical lines, and that the institutions, activities, cultures, and customs that we engage in are the products of past developments and subject to modification over time. Thus, asking one to recognize and define what history is would almost be like getting a fish to give a definition of what water is. Nonetheless, viewing the world and human activity in terms of history is a fundamentally modern phenomenon and does not correspond with the ways previous societies would have understood their place in society, nature, and the universe at large. Thus, to a certain extent, the advent of history as a category through which we understand our activity is itself a historical event. Therefore, beyond the previously stated definitions of Marxism in relation to various aspects of capitalism, all of which do contain a grain of truth, I will attempt in this talk to show how Marxism primarily seeks to understand the coming into being of this modern conception of history, namely through civil or bourgeois society, and views capitalism and the struggle of socialism not merely as a question of morality or of the proper management of society, but rather in terms of a historical task. What I will be presenting will revolve around the thesis that Marxism ultimately is the coming to self-consciousness of the historical tasks that the crisis and contradiction of bourgeois society, also known as capitalism, presents to us. Namely, this is the task of bringing about a new age of freedom that would both complete and go beyond bourgeois social relations. Now, to make this clear, I will do a brief and admittedly, albeit insufficient, sketch of both pre-modern and modern society's conceptions of themselves to highlight the specificity of historical consciousness that Marxism seeks to take up and radicalize. There's obviously a large amount of variety in pre-modern societies, which have many different ways of economic organization, international relations, social conflict, politics, and so forth, that I would be remiss to simply flatten. Nonetheless, it should be emphasized that they all differ from modern understandings in the world. They all differ from modern understandings of the world, in the sense that they all view humans existing in some sort of fixed hierarchy imposed by nature itself. Here by nature, I do not necessarily only mean the environment, but rather the totality of the customs and ways of the past as inherited from generation to generation and ordained by the very structure of the cosmos. What generally categorizes ancient pre-modern societies are certain preordained hierarchical structures to which everyone in society is born. One can see this, for example, in the Indian caste system as split into the priestly Brahmins, a warrior aristocracy, merchant agriculturalists, and, at the bottom, the manual laborers. Or, for example, the ancient Greek states or the early Roman Republic, who, like the Indo-European invaders before them, were led by quasi-divine priest-kings who presided over an assembly of free men who would go out and conquer neighboring territories to gain the booty and slaves which would subsidize their leisurely lifestyles at home. What the ancient societies therefore have in common is that their divinely ordered social structures would set out people's ends in life from the moment they were born. Freedom in these societies essentially means to be what you are meant to be. That is, to fulfill the status granted to you by your family lineage and social custom. If you are a warrior, be the best warrior. If you are a priest, be the most pious. If you are born into a specific guild, then carry out your trade to the best of your ability, and so forth. This is why the worst thing that can possibly happen to you in ancient society would be to be exiled out of your community or to become a slave. That is, to be removed from the eternal order of your particular national, religious, or tribal community. We can therefore see how, even though pre-modern societies were by no means static and were constantly undergoing struggles and changes and bringing about new social formations, technologies, customs, and cultural products, They ultimately did not view their societal activity as the determining factor of their social existence. Rather, it would be the bloodline, allegiance to certain gods, or being under the dominion of this or that emperor or lord who presided over you by right of birth or by right of conquest that would be seen as giving society its ultimate cohesion. In European feudalism, for example, all members of society were linked within the all-encompassing structure of Catholic Christendom, where everybody swears fealty to a lord whose consumption habits they provide for, and every lord is duty-bound in return to provide land and military protection to his subjects. Rather than law and right being determined through assemblies of free individuals, constitutions, and historical struggles, it is custom, tradition, and family that determine the organization of life. Rather than people viewing themselves as reproducing society through their work and labor, it is the scala naturae, or the great chain of being, that links every member of society into a quote-unquote organic divine structure that bounds every member of society from the lowest serf to the king himself in a perennial order. However, beginning in the High Middle Ages, from around the 11th to 14th centuries, feudal society started undergoing profound changes. While the core of the feudal order had been built around decentralized networks of localized estates based primarily on subsistence agriculture, eventually Western states began to become more and more centralized around powerful dynasties with a growing executive power. Events such as the Crusades and the slow Reconquista in Spain opened ancient trade routes that had long been closed, seeing an increase in commercial activity. The investiture controversy between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor in Germany over who had the power to install bishops separated the powers of church and state more completely. In this context of increased dynamism, feudal society began to become conscious of its own structures and began to formalize itself. An example of this was the move away from law being administered primarily at the level of the local lord, and the reinstitution of late Roman civil law by Frederick Barbarossa. The caste dynamic of this great chain of being was formalized into the famous Ancien Régime, the Old Order. This separated society into three clearly divided estates, consisting of the first estate, those who pray, so the clergy, the priests, and so forth. The second estate, those who fight and protect, which would be the feudal lords and the legal administration. And, most importantly for this talk, the third estate, those who work. That would be the serfs, agricultural day laborers, artisans, merchants, traders, and so forth. At this point in the High Middle Ages, with feudal society seemingly at the height of its potential and having formalized its structures to the most self-conscious extent, we begin to see it go into crisis with the rise of a new form of society and with the emergence of a new form of society whose self-conceptions and ways of organizing social activity differed radically from the rigidly hierarchical divine structure of medieval order. This is bourgeois society. By bourgeois, I am not referring to the modern capitalist class known as the bourgeoisie in classical Marxism, nor is it merely a cultural category, such as being bougie, for example. Although I will get to the connection between these two conceptions, originally bourgeois simply refers to the society of the medieval market towns, known then as the bourg. Unlike in surrounding agrarian villages, where peasants were tied to the land and their feudal lords, the towns arose as independent centers of regional commerce, who were not subject to the complex laws of vassalage that bonded people through preordained structures around them. Thus, instead of entering into traditional caste relations of servitude and protection, instead of swearing fealty to lords, city dwellers began swearing an oath amongst equals and reproduced themselves through the free association of friends and engaged in civil society through trading the products of their labor. Hence the old German saying, Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes you free, which referred to the fact that in the Holy Roman Empire, any serf who escaped to a city would become free after living there for a year and a day, and his former lord would have no right to reclaim him. Various contingent developments over the next few centuries, such as the crisis of serfdom, the end of the Reconquista, the discovery of the Americas, development of the printing press, the Italian Renaissance and city-states, the breakup of medieval Catholicism, and so forth, made it such that this way of life was not merely confined to towns and cities, as it is only relatively recently, I think in the early 21st century, that the majority of the world has become urbanized. But rather, bourgeois social relations, with their emphasis on trade, free labor, lack of inherited titles, and so forth, came to encompass the social totality. This primarily means an exaltation of the third estate as the core drivers of society, who produce society neither by sword or conquest, nor by prayer, but rather through their labor, whose products are exchanged in voluntary cooperation with other free individuals in order to satisfy needs and desires that are not preordained by the eternal structure of being, but rather are determined through the freedom of one's becoming and self-transformation. This radically changes history from being either a chronology of events starting from an original founding act in the ancient past, or the mythic intrigues of various kings, warriors, and aristocrats. So an example of this would be the Homeric epics in ancient Greek polytheism, or the Genesis and the Abrahamic covenant in Judaism, the founding of Rome, Jesus' birth for Christianity, the move of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina for Islam, and so forth. History, in bourgeois society, now becomes an account of the reproduction of civil society through actors cooperating in economy and politics, and reconstituting society through their labor and their struggles in the advancement of higher forms of freedom. It is this historical consciousness of the role of their labor in constructing society that led to the bourgeois revolutions of the 18th century, where, rather than being the foundation stone of an internal order holding the nation together in an organic whole, the clergy and the nobility came to be seen rather as a parasitic fetter on the potential of the third estate to transform the world through free cooperative labor. To quote the French revolutionary Abbé Sieyès, what is the third estate? Everything. What has it been in the hitherto existing political order? Nothing. What does it desire? To become something. The Enlightenment, therefore, can be viewed as the coming to self-consciousness of bourgeois society in order to bring about a new form of freedom, not based around actualizing what one would have meant to be done, what one would have meant to have been, in accordance to their ritual position in the community, tribe, or religion. It is a concept of freedom where you as an individual set and realize your own goals through your own activity or labor, in free association and productive cooperation with other individuals. Not only does this conception set a new ethic for the present, but it also shows all previous society to have already been producing the society through their labor and social activity, also known as history. Furthermore, bourgeois society, being global, cosmopolitan, and not bound to local states, lords, or polities, which interact in whatever more or less bounded reciprocity with one another, throws all previous history into question. The bourgeois revolutions, therefore, are not only the replacement of one social order with another, but rather the attempt to have society be able to self-consciously realize the inherent freedom present in all previous history. This marks the shift from history as a mere justification for the perennial existence of a particular social order to universal history, which both reframes the past as having been the product of social activity and the ways people shape their society and how their environments, social and natural, push them to struggle to bring about new modes of existence. Here I should stress that viewing older societies through a historical lens that doesn't exactly correspond to the ways that they view themselves is neither meant to characterize all previous history as being some sort of dark ages, nor does it mean that medieval or ancient people were somehow stupid or making logical errors for not viewing their society in terms of history. Nor does it mean that pre-modern people were somehow ahistorical or perpetuate the racist myth of there being so-called peoples without history. Rather, the ancient conceptions simply corresponded to a different sort of social reality. It wasn't stupid of them to view their society as a preset hierarchy in a structure ordained by the traditions of previous generations, because, in a sense, those were the lines upon which their society was objectively organized. The seeming singularity of bourgeois society and its viewing of the past, present, and future through the lens of history is itself not transhistorical, as it is consistently concerned with putting earlier epochs of history into progression with one another that produces the modern epoch. To understand history as an invention of bourgeois society, rather, is to affirm the past and its various achievements and miseries and the diversity of different social formations as expressions of human society, labor, and cooperation in utilization, interaction with, and transformation of the natural world. Rather than mechanistically viewing the past as a progression from material poverty to industrial productivity, the bourgeois conception of history rather views the past retrospectively, as Hegel put it, as the development of the idea of freedom, which the bourgeois revolutions seek to come to a full self-consciousness of, and sweep aside the barriers restricting freedom's further development. We can therefore see the bourgeois revolutions, such as the French and American revolutions, not only as revolutions of society, but also revolutions for society as such. Rather than merely saying that the capitalist bourgeoisie should rule instead of the aristocrats, they are a revolt of the third estate at large, claiming the right not to existing levers of power, but rather the ability to become something different. Bourgeois revolutions are not just about implementing bourgeois social relations, but rather seek to show that the labor of the third estate is already the real contributor to society, and the aristocrats and clergy are mere parasites, and to bring about a society governed according to the improvement of the lot of the social individual, rather than have it serve past social formations. This means that the bourgeois revolution did not view itself as having reached some final end state, but rather they emphasize being in an age of enlightenment, rather than a fully enlightened age. However, all of what I've been talking about with regard to the outlook of modern self-consciousness in contrast to ancient understandings of the world is not necessarily unique to Marxism, but rather is essentially the core of the Enlightenment and of the bourgeois society in its original conception. As I stated in my thesis, however, Marxism historically viewed itself as registering the crisis of bourgeois society. The name given for the crisis of these bourgeois social relations and their lofty goals is capitalism. Furthermore, what should be stressed in view of capitalism as the crisis of bourgeois society is that it is not merely the implementation of a new system of direct domination and exploitation, where the bourgeoisie rules like its feudal counterparts of yore. Rather, capital is the crisis of the society of free labor itself, and is manifested through the activity of both the ruling and working classes. Hence, the social realities which the bourgeois revolution sought to bring about almost immediately go into crisis after their realization. Rather than creating a harmonious community of individuals who realize their freedom through exchanging the fruits of the labor, the drive towards maximizing efficiency and labor productivity is manifested instead through the rise of industrial capital and its private ownership by the big capitalists who wield far more power than the earlier merchants and artisans. One can clearly see how the emergence of industrial capital immediately comes to put the bourgeois ideals of freedom based on labor into question. In the American Revolution, for example, the founders believed that the expansion of bourgeois property relations and free labor would lead to the gradual disappearance of slavery, showing itself to be obsolete and unproductive. With the Industrial Revolution, however, inventions such as the cotton gin did not lead to the diminishing of slavery, but rather gave it new life and productivity, with the threat of its expansion being more imminent than its dwindling away. In England, France, and America during the 18th century, one saw the gradual increase of living standards for the bulk of the population with the expansion of commercial relations and free labor. Beginning in the industrialized early 19th century, however, one sees what economic historians often refer to as the Engels pause, where both production and population increased at a massive scale, yet a new underclass formed whose standard of living was now stagnant and was being subject to the constant threat of unemployment, something that would have been equally unthinkable to pre-modern society as well as to the bourgeois revolutionaries. One can compare this distorted reality with the original hopes and promises of free trade and wage labor, such as presented by bourgeois radicals such as Adam Smith. I'm quoting Adam Smith here. In that original state of things, which precedes both the appropriation of land and the accumulation of stock, the whole produce of labor belongs to the laborer. He has neither landlord nor master to share with him. Had the state continued, the wages of labor would have augmented with all those improvements in its productive powers to which the division of labor gives occasion. All things would gradually become cheaper, they would have been produced by a smaller quantity of labor, and as the commodities produced by equal quantities of labor would naturally in the state of things be exchanged for one another, they would have been purchased likewise with the produce of a smaller quantity. End quote. With industrial capitalism, however, whose scale and concentration far outweighed the small merchants and artisans of Smith's day, a class arises out of bourgeois society, the proletariat, who has no property and are compelled to sell their labor out of the threat of unemployment. For them, capitalism does not mean the reduction of working time and the improvement of their productive capacity, but rather it is the degradation of labor and the compulsion by the market to relinquish rights to their products of their labor to the capitalist, who sells it back to them for a profit at a higher price. To quote Marx from the Grundrisse, it requires no great penetration to grasp that where free labor or wage labor arising out of the dissolution of bondage is the point of departure, their machines can only arise in antithesis to living labor, as property alien to it, and as a power hostile to it. That is, they must confront it as capital. End quote. Having lost their ancestral rights to the commons to reproduce themselves, yet owning no property on which to base themselves and fully engage in bourgeois society, the emergence of the proletariat is a reality that the bourgeois revolutions did not foresee, and, in many ways, is antithetical to bourgeois right itself. Hence, the bourgeoisie qua ruling class above the proletariat becomes a fetter on the very progress of the bourgeois revolutions that they originally sought to implement for the freedom of society at large. Bourgeois society moves from labor being conducive to a greater freedom and the minimization of labor time, which Adam Smith believed would be achieved through advancing free trade, improvements to technology, and advancement of human skills through the division of labor, towards work no longer serving freedom, but rather directed towards an endless accumulation of capital, in which markets are no longer made of free individuals trading their property, the products of their labor, but rather are dominated by large industrial corporations who wield power over the market through centralized monopolies, cartels, and the control of state violence. Quoting Marx again from the Grundrisse, to the degree that large industry develops, the creation of real wealth comes to depend less and less on labor time, and more on the amount of labor employed than on the power of agencies set in motion during labor time, whose powerful effectiveness is itself in turn out of all proportion to the direct labor time spent on their production, but depends rather on the general state of science and the progress of technology. Real wealth manifests itself in the monstrous disproportion between the labor time applied and its product, as well as in the qualitative imbalance between labor, reduced to a pure abstraction, and the power production it superintends." End quote. It is here in particular that we can see how capitalism is not merely another stage of history defined by explicit exploitation by force by a ruling class, but more fundamentally represents that contradiction of society itself as envisioned and practiced in bourgeois society, freedom through cooperative labor. To quote Max Horkheimer, "Under capitalism, machines have not made work, but the workers superfluous." The laboring free individual is no longer an end in itself, as the radical bourgeois philosopher Immanuel Kant would have hoped, but rather is a mere means to the incessant accumulation of surplus value. Our labor no longer serves the future betterment of our situation and advancing our free potential, as was envisaged by Thomas Jefferson, with bourgeois right being defined as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Rather, capital, through the drive towards its growth, expansion, and accumulation, makes claims upon future generations of humanity for the sake of upholding the past and the mere management of the present. In light of this gloomy picture of capitalism, it is worth here recalling what makes capitalism, like the bourgeois society that spawned it, unprecedented and radically different from earlier epochs, which mark what would also categorize it as making up the history of class society. I consistently emphasized earlier that previous societies would be internally differentiated by a series of caste distinctions that generally would be inherited at birth and determine what activities you could engage in to reproduce society. Whether it is an ancient slave society or medieval serfdom, each estate would form a more or less coherent social group that extracted resources from those below it directly through their fixed status and privileges. However, just as bourgeois society swept the old caste distinctions to level the social order to only those who work, capitalism and the capitalist class cannot be thought of as a separate coherent social group directly oppressing the mass of society, as both the capitalists and the proletariat are part of this third estate, and the capitalists did not obtain their property through socially and legally sanctioned privileges. Rather, capital, as the contradiction of bourgeois society, is the total contradiction of all of society as such, and its class distinctions come out of the contradictions of the productive labor of all groups in the industrial era. To quote Platypus founder Chris Catrone from one of the suggested readings for this teach-in, quote, "Social domination means the domination of society by capital. This is what is new about capital in the history of civilization. Prior forms of civilization knew overt domination of some groups over others, but did not know, as Marx recognized in Capital, a social dynamic to which all social groups, all aspects of society as a whole, are subject." End quote. What this entails is that the laws of capital accumulation put into question the bourgeois order based on a leveled egalitarian playing field of independent free individuals selling the products of their labor in return for equal value on the market. The class structure of capitalism thereby differs from earlier class structures in that its contradictions emerge from the totality of all the labor performed by the third estate, and are not simply imposed from above, but are immanent to the activity of all classes of society. The problem of capitalism's drive towards endless accumulation is not of the problem of exchange itself, which in classical bourgeois thought was viewed as a liberator from domination by custom, tradition, or by direct force, but that exchange, due to the totalizing nature of capital, has to justify itself in the whole circuit of valorization, which means abstract and alien to living human labor. Furthermore, class and capitalism should not be confused with a socio-cultural category. This is a key insight of Marxism that many others on the left miss. Take, for example, the socialist George Orwell, who viewed his democratic socialism as rooted in a cultural defense of the working class and an affirmation of their various comforts and contributions to British national life. Quote, "All the culture that is most truly native centers around things which even when they are communal are not official: the pub, the football match, the back garden, the fireside, and the nice cup of tea." However, what this misses is how class domination by bourgeois society already completes this sort of leveling whereby one's economic stratum is no longer defined by the sort of lifestyle you engage in, whether by right or birth. One could get the bourgeoisie and the proletariat to eat the same types of food, consume the same entertainment, and have the same cultural values, which, to a rather large degree, is already the case. And this would not bring about a proletarian revolution to move beyond capitalism, but would rather simply serve to reinforce bourgeois social relations. What Marx emphasizes the left must understand if it seeks to move beyond capitalism is that modern class is primarily an economic relationship geared towards the reproduction of capital through labor. Your class position is determined by how your labor relates to the reproduction of privately owned capital, thereby differing from both feudal vassalage based around military protection and immediate provisions for the consumption of the feudal lord by the peasantry, and from ancient slavery, where slavery and conquest provides for a free class to engage in leisure, religion, and politics. Despite broadly falling under the modern concept of economic production, in these pre-modern economic relationships, accumulation of capital is not the goal of society in itself, but rather the reproduction of established relationships of hierarchy. None of this means that the laws of value affect everybody in society equally. Marx still recognizes exploitation as a structural feature of capitalism, and that, depending on your class position, you will have more or less freedom in society. Despite capitalism being a situation of generalized unfreedom, the bourgeoisie today, nonetheless, due to their materially superior position, are better situated to enjoy this unfreedom and see their interest in its continued reproduction. However, this should not undermine the key differences between modern class and pre-modern castes or a state. Nonetheless, the continued presence of class is still connected to previous epochs of domination through history, as it is emblematic of the failure of the bourgeois revolution to institute the promised break with all previous history, and how the emergence of capital in bourgeois society ends up reproducing older pathologies and forms of exploitation, yet in new, distorted, and often even more destructive ways. The rise of capital as the contradiction of bourgeois society, that is, the contradiction of a society based on labor, therefore points both to previous history as having been a function of this contradiction, and to future history as being guided by the necessity to overcome the abstract domination of the society of labor. The key insight that Marxism provides is that if we are able to overcome the contradictions of capitalism, it must be through an overcoming of a society based on labor itself, and not the mere replacement of the capitalist class by the working class at its helm. All of this begs the question, however, of the left and its relationship to capitalism. What Marx noticed in his time was that the various movements associated with discontent with capitalism and the poverty it produced posed their critiques ultimately from a standpoint that remained within the horizons of bourgeois society, whether this was the early utopian socialists, anarchists such as Proudhon, or the trade union movement. Therefore, rather than simply being a counter-hegemonic force, the left is born out of capitalism's own dynamics and is an integral part of what pushes it forward and causes capitalism to reconstitute itself. In the age of capitalism, which sees the phenomena of mass unemployment, economic exploitation, and the increasingly stifling management of civil society by the state, the organized proletariat, nonetheless, poses a threat to the capitalist class by demanding the very bourgeois rights and freedom that the capitalist order purports itself to be based on: the right to work, the right to be paid a fair wage in proportion to one's labor, and the right to freely take part and engage in free association in civil society. Rather than either simply rejecting these demands of the left as bourgeois, or affirming them as guaranteeing the workers a better lot within capitalist society as it is already constituted, Marxism sought to bring to the proletariat and to the left an understanding of their place and tasks within history at large, both as a force which is symptomatic of capitalism's discontents and a mechanism of its continual reconstitution, as well as what points beyond capitalist relations of production. By understanding capitalism to be the contradiction of bourgeois society and the movement of the proletariat to be a core driving force from within it, Marxism seeks to show how it is the workers and the proletariat, not the capitalists, who are the core essential element of modern production. It is they who are the most indispensable to modern capitalist society. Furthermore, if socialism is symptomatic of the discontents of industrial capital, hence the transition from capitalism to socialism in a certain way is imminent to capital itself, and the highest expression of it and bourgeois social relations, not simply just the replacement of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat. Therefore, the overcoming and abolition of capital must not be understood as the abolition of the exploitative capitalist class, but also of the self-consciousness, self-abolition of the proletariat as well, whose alienated labor reproduces capitalism, not merely the creation of a new mode of production, but more radically a move beyond a society based around labor. It is this that is the key insight of Marxism and is emblematic of the historical self-consciousness that it attempted to bring to the socialist left. It is precisely because Marx wished to see the left succeed in its demands and desires that he sought to bring this critical self-awareness of its place in bourgeois society, capitalism, and history at large. This understanding stands in contrast with various strands of the left, which either seek to simply secure the workers' rights and well-being within capitalism through greater equality, or the wish to implement a society of the proletariat, with the view that capitalists are merely bad managers, or following an incorrect, evil, or immoral society of how to run society. Or a moral theory of how to run society, which only the proletariat can provide. What Marxism provides is neither a merely defensive anti-capitalism that seeks to conserve existing bourgeois rights, nor an attempt to tear down capitalism from an outside position or return to pre-modern models of society. Capitalist modernity, as the reactionary right or romantic anarchist left correctly claims, shows itself to be a destructive force. As Marx said in the Communist Manifesto, it dissolves all previous social bonds, cultures, the environment, religion, and wastes human potential. Furthermore, given capitalism's failure to complete the bourgeois project, and the fact that we continue to see elements of older forms of society resurge, the tendency to want to return to the past or grab onto any remaining shreds of tradition is to a certain degree understandable. To quote Marx again, in bourgeois political economy, and in the epoch of production to which it corresponds, this complete elaboration of what lies within man appears as the total alienation and destruction of all fixed, one-sided purposes, as the sacrifice of the end in itself to a wholly external compulsion. Hence, in one way, the childlike world of the ancients appears to be superior, and this is so insofar as we seek for a closed shape, form, and established limitation. The ancients provide a narrow satisfaction, whereas the modern world leaves us unsatisfied, or, where it appears to be satisfied with itself, is vulgar and mean." End quote. However, Rather than actually returning to the past, these sorts of romantic ideologies only end up extinguishing possibilities in the present, and are never actually able to either conceive of or effectuate the so desired return to societies where means and ends were clearly set out within bounded communities and set social structures. For example, fascism, while attempting to implement a pre-modern organic holeless society and reverse time to an idyllic pre-industrial past, end up hypostasizing the modern nation-state and committing crimes now viewed as the pinnacle of the modern industrialized destruction of human life. Marxism, by both recognizing the original promise of bourgeois society, as well as the necessary reasons for its contradiction, and posing capitalism and the proletariat as well as transitional to a higher freedom, seeks to reveal the meaning of modernity as something historically transitional to an age where people can live and flourish without labor needing to be the basis of their social structures. The struggle for socialism must therefore not be thought of either in terms of justice or morality, but rather, above all, in terms of history and its inherent possibilities. However, just as dangerous as the romantic rejection of the modern world is a socialism that merely affirms capitalist relations and acts only as a conduit for industrialization, such as Stalinism, Communist China, various forms of 20th century developmentalist socialism, or post-war social democracy. A left that is conscious of its historical tasks would rather show that capitalism may itself be transitional to a world where we are not compelled to work to reproduce ourselves, and hence even bourgeois society, with all its contradictions, can both be fulfilled and overcome. Any future emancipatory politics must regain such awareness of the transitional nature of capitalist modernity and of the reasons why we pay such a steep price for failing to recognize this. One can see capitalism as a certain stage of social development, of which socialism and communism would be another. Yet this already brings with it the unique vantage point of history itself that is specific to bourgeois modernity. Marxism must seek to make the left grasp the tasks that come along with the advent of this new conception of mankind, as well as its crisis. To quote again Chris Catrone, thus, with Marx, a philosophy of the history of the left was born. For Marx was not a socialist or communist so much as a thinker who tasked himself with understanding the meaning of the emergence of proletarian socialism in history. Marx was not simply the best or most consistent or radical socialist, but rather the most historically and hence critically self-aware. By scientific socialism, Marx simply understood himself to be elaborating a form of knowledge aware of its own conditions of possibility. The left must therefore understand itself not only as either a particular sociological element of bourgeois capitalist society, the harbinger of socialism, or a force that seeks to eliminate all exploitation, all of which it, of course, at some level is. Rather, a renewed Marxist left would have to see its task as the intervention into what the philosopher Walter Benjamin called now time, that is, all of prior history congealed into the present moment, where we can either shirk from the moment to allow the wreckage of capitalism and all previous class society to keep piling up, or we can take up this historical task to bear this consciousness of the present and push it forward to realize historical potential for a new age of freedom. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you very much, Max.
How long was I?
I don't know, I wasn't keeping time.
Okay.
Moving on your phone.
Well, we can check the voice recording.
Yeah, about 50 minutes. That's okay.
Much longer than I
That's
thought.
great.
Yeah.
Always the way.
That's really good.
So now we're going to open out for any questions, any comments or thoughts that people had on it, addressed to you, Max, or just addressed to anyone in the room if you want to try and get a conversation going.
I had one, maybe just to start us off. So talking about this difference between ancient and modern freedom, or ancient and modern society. I think it's quite an important maybe inscription, at least for like this theory of capitalism as transitional to kind of like a higher stage of social consciousness and freedom. But I think that being said, we can take recent examples of politics in the left of rejecting the distinction and maybe flattening the distinction, right, between kind of modern and ancient social relations. So something that sprung to mind was David Graeber as like a very recent example of this symptom, where he's like very consciously anti-Rousseauian, so kind of like rejects the distinction of kind of like modern kind of organic solidarity. I mean, I know I'm confusing that with kind of like Durkheim now, but this kind of like these new bourgeois forms of social relations, and instead wants to reinscribe this kind of like ancient communalism and cooperation as like the basis for what the left should kind of aspire to, or kind of like that's kind of seen as the task is actually more of a return than as a progression, and which you kind of address near the end of your teaching. So I guess the question I had was more, could you speak to why it might be that this seem, you know, you put it well in terms of bringing out this antinomy that you have in the left between kind of like the romantic and then like the affirmative hype, like modern, right? So could you speak to why kind of in the millennial left, so let's say like late 2000s, early 2010s, there might have been a turn towards this kind of ancient freedom, right? Or like this romanticism, and whether in any way this could be an opportunity towards the reconstruction of a vital leftist politics, right? So, which I know you already kind of said, right? It's like, it's understandable that you would want to return to a simpler kind of society, right? There's an argument to be made, or that people do make, that the complexity and the complexity of society now and the division of labor, as well as its kind of unfettered nature of like constant production, is actually destroying society itself. So you want to return to something simpler. So why do you think the millennial left, and maybe we're still currently in this moment, would make that turn? And it's a bit of a weird one, but I want to hear your thoughts.
Well, I can think of potentially why young people today and millennials in general, not necessarily even just the left, would want that sort of return. And, you know, one reason is something it has to do with, I mentioned in the talk that this urban revolution, not the earlier bourgeois revolution, but the urban revolution, where the majority of society lives in cities that have been uprooted from ancient, well, not even ancient, even for a lot of people just in the past 50 or so years, their parents used to live in some village or some town, and we've been drawn into a very alienated world, honestly. Like, it's at a fundamental level, when people, even the social democratic rights that they thought they had are being lost, and people are working, not in a unionized atmosphere, but with the gig economy. They're being contracted through apps and outsourcing. When social life and communities are harder and harder to come by, especially for millennials who to a larger degree than any generation before them have been educated, have gone away to university, have found themselves removed from both their original communities. However, have also found it that once they enter the workforce, they don't get what was promised to them in the previous social democratic compact, where getting credentialized, going to university would be the way to a sort of comfortable middle class lifestyle. that is, that's becoming less and less of a possibility. So in a way, that's one reason why you could easily see why millennials would turn to what you call, correctly, I think, a more ancient communalist understanding of what socialism would be. Another more obvious one, I think, reason would be, the failure of millennial left-wing movements, the complete implosion of the Corbyn campaign, the Bernie campaign, just sort of, giving up in the face of COVID, just like putting down the reins and acquiescing to Obama crowning Biden as the Democratic nominee, and that for a glimmer, for whatever maybe misguided reasons that we at Platypus could definitely get into about these original neo-social democratic projects were, the complete and utter implosion of them so quickly would make somebody like Graeber seem extremely attractive, because Graeber, one of his main things is the communism of everyday life. And when he describes it, it can sound very nice. He says, when you're in a group of friends, and 1 week you buy your friend a drink at the pub, and you don't, and then next week your friend will make it up to you, and it's just immediate reciprocity, which as an anthropologist, he is taking this from earlier modes of existence quite explicitly, gift economies of the sort, that can, at the one hand, seem very nice. It can appeal to what we find comfortable. It can appeal to whatever memories, real or imagined, of community that exist for us. But at the same time, it's also it's a notion of community that's rather facile in a way, because you don't actually have to change anything to bring about the communism of everyday life. So Graeber, who has, he has some interesting anthropological insights about stuff like debt, but when it comes to his actual program, it can appeal to basically anybody. It can appeal to, an actually exploited proletarian gig worker, to someone working at an office job high up at a bank who is annoyed at working, 12 to 14-hour days. And, to a certain extent, Marxism should be able to actually kind of appeal to both people. It should recognize that, as I tried to emphasize, we are all in a way subject to the same laws of value, the same laws of capital accumulation. But at the same time, when you just make it about sort of embracing your immediate surroundings or making community whatever you see and feel in a quasi-animist way, it's not actually looking at why we got here. It's not looking at the crisis of bourgeois society, and it's not looking at the promise of bourgeois society to a certain extent, which it was originally about making different types of community. It would be about making types of community that would not be preordained upon you. So there would be a notion of individual responsibility in creating the community and freely associating, which hopefully socialism would be able to bring about. So yeah, I don't know, that was a bit rambly, but hopefully that got a little bit of what you were asking about.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it does get to this issue of what it means to kind of live in a world without a left. Because I kind of get the sense that when people read Graeber, or when young people read Graeber, and feel some attraction to the ancient world, or some kind of perennial communist, what have you. Really what they're kind of hankering for is like the welfare state, right? There's this kind of it's a kind of and I guess the reason it poses the question of the left, or the absence of the left, is that like back in the 1960s and 1970s, there was like a kind of leftist discontent against the welfare state, and not just leftist, like a kind of general there was just obviously a kind of crisis with it, of its politics and of its kind of political legitimacy. The kind of the post World War II welfare state world was like at the time felt to be like terribly alienating, kind of fragmented. It kind of split people into these kind of it's like the lonely crowd, like this kind of idea. And whereas like in retrospect it kind of comes to seem like some kind of high point for like solidarity or like social or some level of like social mutual obligation or something like that. Cohesion, right? And the reason that poses the issue of the left is like, partly because of course like the left flips over, from having a critique of the welfare state to wanting to defend the welfare state. But on a kind of deeper level, there is a kind of absence of, a kind of historical memory to even like make sense of these shifts. It just seems like, it seems like one damn thing after another, or it feels like some kind of decline from an imagined like previous high point. Like history just seems like we used to be more kind of together or something, but now we're kind of not anymore. And it's why the kind of Marx quote that you bring up about the ancient world seeming charming or appealing in some way is really important, like as a like precisely as a kind of symptom of modernity itself, right? That we kind of long for a kind of previous era, but that itself is like a kind of misrecognition of like capitalism in some sense, right? So I don't know. I guess it kind of it's an interesting point, and it kind of gets to this issue of when people seem to be kind of harking for like ancient or some kind of more like stable, solid like grounding to society or to their lives. That's actually what seems to be expressed as the kind of meaninglessness of history in capitalism, that it doesn't seem to, that it seems to have been like evacuated of meaning in some sense. And so that's not to say that like the left is the kind of cure to that, or like if you want to find meaning in your life, be a leftist or something. But the issue would be like just posing that issue of a kind of crisis of history and of historical memory in a more acute way, I guess. If that makes sense. That was a bit of a ramble as well.
So what I think I very much agree about that, and I tried to emphasize in my talk, is that the degree to which a return is A, not even possible, and B, not even thinkable. And whenever we try to formulate a return or try to, say we're going to put forth an older form of society, whether it's in a progressive language, as Graeber would have it, or an outright, reactionary language, as the far right would put it, it's always distorted in some way. It's never actually, we're not actually going to get back to being ancient Greek Platonists. We're not actually going to get back to the pre-modern Catholic Church. Whatever ideas about a non-capitalist society that we try to come up with that aren't about confronting capitalism and what it is a contradiction of, which is bourgeois society, the relations that we're living in now. If we don't deal with that and try to transform that as our main task, then we will come up with various ideas that maybe on the surface level will seem to be counter-hegemonic, to exist outside of, capitalist exploitation, capitalist alienation, lack of community or whatever, but in the end they will end up just reproducing capitalist society. And I didn't address this fully with regards to capitalism, except for a brief discussion of fascism, but I think an analog is, I mentioned how the Ancien Régime is actually a sort of late medieval formation, and it only came about as the structuring principle of society once the medieval era was kind of in crisis. So it didn't actually. So even the conservative late medieval authorities trying to assert themselves in the face of this rising bourgeois society, while trying to formalize their society and what they thought was meant to be conservative about it, and put it in more modern terms. Well, it was precisely that. They were putting it in terms that medieval society never was actually in originally. Something like absolute monarchy, for example, that never actually existed. The divine right of kings never actually existed in the medieval era. So I think that's a correlate to how, when you try to think of a return, whether now or in pre-capitalism, you're going to think of it still along the lines of the new society, in a way that will end up reproducing the new society. So we can only actually overcome our condition by going through, not by returning before it, or trying to step outside of it, or like Graeber, just try to create an immediate community where you're at. It has to be through. And I think hopefully that was the main point that came out of my talk. So.
Jay, I wanted to ask, I know this is your first time out teaching the Platypus. What did you, was there anything that was mentioned in Max's presentation that you thought was interesting or that you wanted him to expand on?
I honestly thought it was a very good, sort of explanation of all the concepts that you guys kind of were throwing around that I didn't really understand earlier. And I think it was a very good beginning point. Actually, let me just open my notes to see what I wrote down. One thing I was a little bit not confused on, but I wanted you to expand more, is the idea of all of society being that third estate, and all of society sort of, the contradiction of capitalism. I know Marx was at some point it's really just gonna reach that zenith, but do you think that in this sort of, do you think that there is a possibility of not leftist return but rightist return of bringing back the idea of first, second estates, the idea of you see heiresses, right? And they don't do labor for their wealth, and that's such a rare case. But that's do they count as third estate then? Sorry, that's just the question.
Yeah. So
is Paris Hilton a member of the third estate?
So Paris Hilton, I guess, would not be. Well, Paris Hilton maybe if she was born. Maybe if 300, if Paris Hilton was around 300 years ago, she would have been a member of the third estate. But when the third estate becomes the only game in town, it sets its own rules, and that's what the bourgeois revolutions, to an extent, were about. So, if you look at France, for example, the Abbé CS, the French revolutionary who I quoted in my talk, what he mentions is that the third estate, by the time of the French Revolution, even though the king and the clergy are still ruling, make up the bulk of the tax revenue for the government. So he's saying that the third estate, they're basically.
But it doesn't define. What doesn't change? I mean, it was the peasants who were working, were providing for the king before that. It's not like the third estate used to be 25% of the tax revenue in 2000, in 2001 year, 2200, and during the French Revolution it's grown. It's not about the size of the tax base, is it?
That's a fair point. I think I was just trying to illustrate that his point is that the third estate are basically the productive drivers of society. And I think and you know, maybe and today it's kind of a weird point to make, because, you know, if we look back at earlier epochs where it's a tiny minority of people doing the praying and the defending, like, we might say, oh, like, it's quite obvious that these people were being exploited. It's quite obvious that, you know, these cathedrals are not being built by the lords themselves or by the priests themselves. Yet that is an event that is related to the revolt of the, well, not just related, it is the event of historical standing that the Third Estate brings about. So to maybe answer the technical question, like, the Third Estate is not like, it is not a governing concept of modern bourgeois society. Bourgeois society, although it starts in the Third Estate, has revolutions for its own existence. So there, I borrowed the term the revolution of and for society from James Vaughan, who is another Platypus member. You can see some of his talks on the YouTube. And he, for example, talks about, you know, the expansion of bourgeois relations in colonial America, and how this was basically this coming out of the late medieval period with the emergence of towns, and then, you know, transcontinental commercial relations. That is the revolution of bourgeois society, in the sense that bourgeois society is gaining strength. It's becoming a larger and larger percentage of, well, both like a larger and larger percentage of society, which of course is not the main thing, but ultimately becomes more and more conscious of itself as the driver of society. And then the bourgeois revolutions are the revolutions for society as such, where so that the Third Estate is the only thing that exists, effectively.
Well, I think what I was trying to get at here, you know, the question of, is Paris Hilton a member of the Third Estate, right? And then with the point about the productive part of society, is that what changed is not that the Third Estate started, like, you know, being just more self-aware of the fact that it's being it is producing what the society needs and what, you know, entirety of the social metabolism consumes, but also it started understanding labor as the primitive, like the primary property that you own, and you're free to sell on the free exchange. And it is on the basis of emergence of labor as this universal equalizer between all of humanity that the concept of society can emerge, right? So is Paris Hilton a member of the Third Estate? I mean, I'd say yes, because you can think of becoming Paris Hilton. Like, I can see myself, like, you know, I can imagine myself, like, doing DJ sets in the White House. And, I mean, in a sense that...
Can you imagine yourself being born into wealth?
Well, sure, I mean, it's you know, it's partially it's but becoming born into wealth, of course, but she was born into wealth. But at the same time, it's not like me and Paris Hilton, or like any of us, are impossible to compare against one another, in a way that you wouldn't really be able to compare a peasant and a queen, right? That you know, that it's that there is this just shared equality. So in this sense, the society is different, and in this sense, also class is psychologically much difficult to just bear, right? Because, you know, in medieval ages, you were just a peasant. This is just the way life is, and you're born a peasant, you'll stay a peasant, you'll die a peasant. That's it, right? And now, you know, I basically have to psychologically feel bad that you're not as beautiful, as accomplished, you know, and as musically talented as Paris Hilton, right? That there is really, it's really quite distressing. I wake up every morning, I think, oh my god, I mean, you know.
There's another funny example. Well, I'd say, like, maybe another way of putting it is that, like, even if you're born into wealth, you can still fall, right? It's like, it's not like your position is socially sanctioned by a divine order of being. It's sanctioned by, like, how much money you own, right? Or how much capital you have, right? If it's not, like, labor that you can extend. But even then, you know, like, the UK is a really interesting example of, like, aristocrats kind of falling into, like, really weird poverty and having to learn new, like, their own trade, right? So a lot of them will go to, like, agricultural school, to learn how to like run different estates. So that's kind of like that. And then the way that they live their life isn't sanctioned by kind of like being born as an aristocrat. It's actually like how well that they can be a capitalist, which is a different kind of social relation. And there are stories of kind of aristocrats falling into poverty if they can't adapt.
A driver of the whole of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen is, perspective of pauperization and poverty of the five sisters. I mean, they have to marry rich. Like, Emma falls in love with Mr. Knightley when she sees his carriage. It's very bourgeois.
Jane Austen, like that.
I don't read Jane Austen, so I wouldn't know.
Well,
Yeah, you got it.
I'm
You
happy
got it.
you guys have lives. Like, it's great.
There was also something I wanted to bring up, and this in terms of, so I think it's interesting trying to explain Marxism and kind of so Marx's conception of capitalism and the historical task without, and this is given, so we read Capital and History a couple of weeks before we do something like the 18th Vermeer, right? And that kind of the added twist is actually the political, the necessity for politics for that continued, or a couple of things, but the role that the state plays in capitalism, and then that for necessary for politics to actually kind of seize the state, seize that whole operation of the state. If that makes sense. I mean, I know it's opening up a whole other question, but I guess another way of getting at it is in bourgeois society we saw it develop almost organically, right? It started with this kind of furthering and furthering development in the division of labor and trade, kind of ongoing universalization of the world. And then you had the bourgeois revolutions, right? So you had the fight, what was the distinction that James made? There was in society and for society?
Revolution of and
society and for, right?
society,
So the actual politics of the bourgeois revolution comes at the very end, right? The transformation had already occurred, the social transformation had already occurred, and then it was kind of formalized in this kind of political struggle. How could you, so I wonder if you could start to get into, and I understand if we might want to defer it, but if you could get into what role politics has in this task of consciousness and history, I guess, right? So you said the role of a Marxist is actually to bring historical consciousness to the struggle of the left. Why does it have to be the left, right? This kind of political phenomena as opposed to society, right? Why can't we, you know what I mean? There's this funny little role that politics is playing within capitalism and history. And I wonder if you could speak to that. I'm sorry, that's
no. So why it would be the left rather than society as such?
Yeah.
And why?
Why can't society just do this by itself?
Why can't society just?
Yeah.
Why can't society can't?
Why do we need a kind
Well,
of
society in a way can't just do this by itself because society's kind of already done that. I mean, that's what the bourgeois revolution is, right? I mean, it's that the bourgeois revolution is the revolutionary for society as such, and capitalism throws that all into question. So if we have more and more revolutions that are just about asserting the people, populism, then we're just kind of repeating ourselves and not really engaging with the problem, the fundamental problem of capital. So why would be the left? I'd say it is because, well, if you were talking about how the revolution sort of comes at the end of development. The revolution 4 is once this thing is already developed. Well, Marx is kind of seeing a pretty well developed left in his lifetime. There's already been from the radical strains of the French and American revolutions, the early utopian socialists, to the trade union movement, it's already clear that actually there is a group of people in society calling themselves the left who are noticing that capitalism does not fulfill what it promises. It does not fulfill the bourgeois rights it promises. It's ultimately people who want to be productive members of capitalist society. But the problem is with the left at this point, and which Marxism tries to intervene in, is that the left, when viewing things just in terms of the people, or at an even smaller level in terms of interest groups, a trade union, for example, then that only really reproduces the contradiction of society to a certain extent. Which does not mean that Marx does not want, the leftists that he sees around him who aren't necessarily fully fledged Marxists yet to not be in power. He's not against their goals in that sense. But and it's difficult because I can't say what the solution is just here for how we would be able to fully actualize those goals yet also go beyond them, because the question of politics is actually to bring about the situation where we could even have the chance to do that, which Marx would call dictatorship or proletariat. Now, it is a difficult question, and maybe it is just related to the fact that currently we do not have a left, or we do not have a left that would be true to the original contradiction that brought it about. And as you were talking about, Rory, the left today is kind of just nostalgic for earlier forms of capitalism. It's a result of the misery of capitalism, but it doesn't view itself as maybe asserting these fundamental bourgeois rights that capitalism should be offering it us. It says it's asking to be patriarchally paternalized by the state in a certain sense. Or if you're graver, it's kind of the opposite. It's asking to just let's just create whatever we can where we are at any moment in any way that kind of suits us, not in relation to the total functioning of society, but rather in relation to just my fellow man next to me or whatever. So yeah, I don't know, maybe that's a long answer maybe that's a long explanation why I don't have a complete answer to that question, but hopefully that frames the problem a bit more clearly.
I also had a question that goes right back to kind of when we were talking about David Graeber, because I think in the debt book that you brought up, Max, David Graeber kind of rejects Rousseau and rejects the thought experiment of the state of nature of Rousseau, and he prefers empirical anthropology. He says we actually have to look at how these communities, how do they materialistically relate to each other, and that kind of got me thinking about the relationship of materialism to idealism, which are two kind of categories that you hear all the time in the left. If you go to any kind of left Marxist festival or any kind of pedagogical group, you'll hear about materialism, Marxism, and then idealism, perhaps of Kant or Hegel. So I just wanted to raise the Enlightenment as kind of a part of your talk. You mentioned how in some respects the Enlightenment was an expression of or a recognition of bourgeois society and the kind of freedom that kind of is bound up within it. So I was wondering if you could maybe say something about the relationship of Marxism to the Enlightenment, to Marx and Engels and the Enlightenment, but also perhaps what your thoughts are on this kind of supposed antinomy of materialism and idealism, or what the relationship between those things are in your mind.
Sure. Yeah, that's a tough one. with regards to the, maybe I'll try and do two birds, one stone. The move to talk about materialism as opposed to idealism, for Marxism to say we're materialists as opposed to idealists, I don't think it's an ontological claim about the structure of reality. Marx isn't saying, okay, yeah, Berkeley thought everything was just through our ideas and our mind, and therefore we're saying everything is just like raw inert matter. Like, whatever side of that equation you want to take, I don't think that's what Marx is taking. I think Marx's materialism is related to his role of of registering a crisis of bourgeois society, in the sense that labor for bourgeois society is an ideal. In a sense, it is an ideal that can be perfected. It is an ideal that we engage in our everyday activity, and the crisis of that ideal is capital. So with capital, it is not really, capital can't be said to be an ideal that comes in and fights against the purer ideal of bourgeois labor, but rather it comes out of bourgeois labor itself, and furthermore, it's foreign to humans. It's part of the material world. It has to do with it has to do with our labor being what later Marxists would say reified, which means thingified, basically. It's turned into something belonging to material nature and machines, and our labor is not an ideal through which we actualize our freedom, but rather the material world is, the material world becomes the problem, essentially, for Marxism. So to relate that to, I think to relate that to the Enlightenment, Marx isn't really saying like materialism is this absolute antinomy to idealism in this way. An ancient idealist and an ancient materialist would maybe argue in Plato's Academy about these two different things, but rather it's registering a shift in the problem, I think.
Yeah, and I guess the concept of freedom is also related here that you brought up, because in a sense it's central to bourgeois understanding of society, and which you said capitalism is a self-contradiction of. And it was also coming up in my mind just the end of the Horkheimer aphorism, the little man and the philosophy of freedom, when he ends on saying that it's crucially important for humanity and for the little man, the Marxist clarification of the concept of freedom they brought into light. And what you just said kind of reminded me of this, in terms of there is a need for a critique rather than a rejection of kind of these supposedly idealistic concepts like freedom in history.
If I just say one thing that just came to mind as just a slight clarification, this is also what I was talking about in my talk, and about how capitalism is it is a generalized unfreedom. So in the sense, this ideal of bourgeois freedom doesn't exist anywhere in capitalist society, except as like a sort of unconscious potential. However, what Marx emphasized over and over again, and is basically the core argument of capital, is that doesn't mean that exploited. It doesn't mean that workers aren't exploited, and class is an economic relationship. Just just because it's not an ancient form of class doesn't mean that this generalized unfreedom doesn't affect different people in different ways. So maybe that is the material question that Marxism tries to refer to, rather than saying, is everything atoms, or is everything just our perception? It's the seeing how the contradiction of the ideal of freedom manifests differently materially for different people and different groups of society, and we should therefore look for freedom potentially in that part of society who, because of their material condition, is best able to register this generalized unfreedom.
Okay, yeah. Any final questions, or should we bring it to a close? Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Max. It was
Great.
great.
That was very, very
Thank
good.
you. Thank you.